Hello and welcome to the Age of Games channel. This is Josiah and I've got opinions on gaming stuff. Now, let's talk for a second. This video is just going to be some speculation and adding to the theory that I posted yesterday because the video was going long and I couldn't get everything that I wanted to get in the video. So, let's keep talking about it. So I've been playing, as I said before, I've been playing Skyward Sword a bit, and the ancient robots do in fact confirm that they are charged or powered by the time shift stones. So that's confirmation. That blue energy flowing through them into their arms is not electricity. That is the time shift stone, which also means that's not necessarily what the time shift stones aren't only for shifting time. That's not all they're for. They can also power things. They can also be like fuel. For instance, the fuel inside the Guardians, maybe. Another thing, the ancient spring. Well, first of all, let me just say this outright. What does this theory about the Sheikah being this ancient civilization that was very highly technologically advanced and that ran off of time shift stones? What does that say about the timeline placement of Breath of the Wild? Nothing, really, because if this is happening in the unified timeline, if these robots and all this, if all this is in the unified timeline, honestly, it doesn't really mean anything for where Breath of the Wild is in the timeline. It doesn't really touch on my after Zelda 2 theory that I posted. It's just something that I've seen, and I've seen parallels, and the makers of Skyward Sword would have had this in their mind while making parts of Skyward Sword, because they basically wrote a whole story. They wrote a whole timeline. So that being said, the ancient spring that you find on mini Guardians, but there's also a spot where you find them. There's this trashed Guardian that's kind of in the ground half, and next to it you can find an ancient spring. The description of them basically just says that it's like a spring that doesn't follow the laws of deterioration. Basically, it doesn't, no matter how much you spring it, it doesn't do anything. But it also says that it is an actual ancient spring of a time long past. Now, let's say that the Guardians just came into existence 100 years before. Let's say the things on this tapestry, right? Those took place 100 years ago, and right now that's currently Breath of the Wild. Okay, let's say that. Would you call let's go 100 years back. Let's 1917. If you found a coin from 1917, would you call that coin ancient? I wouldn't. I mean, I would call it rare, and I would call it vintage, and I would call it an incredible find, right? And it would be worth a lot of money if it was from 1917. But that's not quite ancient. You would have to go back at least 1,000 years, or somewhere around there, to be considered ancient. And the things that other people pointed out as well, the sea salt, the ancient sea salt. I think it's sea salt. It might be another item, but it says, this is an item from an ancient sea, right? Now, people are like, oh, the sea in Wind Waker. Well, if this is in the Downfall timeline, of course, that can't be the case. So, likely, it's referring to the sea in the Sea of Sand, which became the Sea of Sand, but it wasn't the Sea of Sand. It was actually a sea. It was actually like a wide ocean, and you see that with the time shift stones. And if this was the whole if they're referring to an ancient sea, I would think, and if they're referring to that sea, I would think that they're pointing back to Skyward Sword. So that's even more reason for us to really crack down on Skyward Sword and figure out what happened before Skyward Sword, right? Also, so these are ancient springs. When you describe these things as ancient, they don't mean just 100 years ago, right? They don't mean just like, oh, whatever. They're meaning ancient, as in like ancient manuscripts, tapestries, fragments, things like that, right? So another thing, I was playing Skyward Sword, and when I first walked into a thing, I was like, the Temple of Time. It says it's the Temple of Time. Now, Hyrule Historia doesn't say that the Temple of Time was established until Rauru established it after Skyward Sword, but apparently there was an ancient Temple of Time, which is interesting, and I forgot about. And then, when you walk up to Mr. Goron, he says there were people who walked past who looked exactly like those mentioned in the ancient manuscripts. And so I'm like, whoa, hold on a second. So there's a Temple of Time, first of all, and another thing worth noting is that the Hylian crest is above the Temple of Time. It's the Triforce and the wings. So clearly, the kingdom of Hyrule was established based on whatever this kingdom was. So in the tapestry, when it talks about the king and the princess and all this, that symbol already exists before Skyward Sword. So if that's the case, the Temple of Time is very old, at least this particular one, and it was mentioned that the goddess made it, or she made the Gate of Time, rather. So if these people were the Sheikah, it makes sense, because even way back then they were defending the goddess. They were following where the goddess went, because if the valley, right, if the sand valley is where the Sheikah used to be and where they used to hang out, right? I mean, they made the robots. The robots were there to mine time shift stones, for more power, more energy. If the Sheikah really were there and that was them, then that's where they were. That was their home base, and that's where they were defending the Temple of Time. Another thing worth mentioning: you find Gerudo dragonflies in that desert, which may point. I'm not entirely sure, because there are other things that you get that aren't current, because you get the Gerudo dragonflies just in that thing. You don't have to go like back in time to get them, to be able to capture them. So when you capture them, they say Gerudo. So it's possible that currently there, other people call it the Gerudo Valley and stuff like that. But it could be that the Gerudo and the Sheikah have a similar ancestor. That is possible as well. But back to what the Goron said. When the Goron says, "Oh, they were dressed like," or the person from the sky was dressed like the people in the ancient manuscripts. There's that tapestry. It shows that white, long flowing robe, exactly like what Zelda wears in Skyward Sword. So is that tapestry what that Goron is referring to? That would be pretty rad and pretty amazing. But there's just. Also, speaking of the Sheikah, I saw, when I first saw Impa in Skyward Sword, I saw her, and it made me think of that princess. it made me think of that princess on the back of that tapestry. That princess has dark skin and like bleach blonde hair. Impa has that in Skyward Sword. She has very like bleach blonde hair, dark skin, and that depiction doesn't look like Zelda. So maybe the Gerudo, and maybe because the Gerudo are so old, maybe it's that the Gerudo are old, which is where Ganon's ancestor comes from, and perhaps the princess who was in that past is no longer the princess. Their ancestors are now the defenders of the royal family, but they're no longer the princess. Impa's this is why Impa keeps getting reincarnated. Impa keeps getting reincarnated because she was once the princess, but she's not the princess anymore. That's possible. So I don't know. There's a lot of things. There's a lot of things that I don't know. There's a lot of things that are connecting. I'm gonna keep playing Skyward Sword. I'm gonna keep trying to find connections, and if I find a huge one, then I will be on this channel talking to you guys. So if you guys have any thoughts or opinions on what I mentioned in this video, post in the comments below. Thank you very much for listening.